was very simple. By each author, I have tried to understand how he understood the problem of mimesis eigentlich. Und these authors didn't use the concept, but when we read them, we can feel, we can see something with in connection with this concept. I have used several authors in this perspective, but for example, Frantz Fanon and Axel Kabou. For example, when I read the both authors, I can say there is no connection, but they both deal with post-colonial Africa. Frantz Fanon stressed on the attitude for African in colonial side. And the attitude for Africans in front of the colonizer. And today, Africans suffered from this attitude. That's the perspective from Frantz Fanon. But Axel Kabou, from Cameroon, insists in another perspective. Okay, according to Axel Kabou, Africa has suffered from colonizer. This is clear. But in the today's situation for Africa, the Africans must recognize their responsibilities. That's in another perspective. The perspective is very, very different.
All right, thank you. And now I will present the monetary award of $1,000 for second place in the Schwager Award. This year's winner in first place for the Schwager Award is Ivan Camilo Vargas Castro. He's from Colombia. He is in the PhD program of development studies at the University of the Basque Country. He also works at Caritas Colombia. This is his second cover meeting, and so we welcome him.
I'm grateful with the cover committee and especially with Jeremiah in representation of the cover committee. I am a little nervous, so I want to begin with a few considerations to be clear. First of all, my presentation is entitled Border Citizenship, Justice and Hospitality in the Border Region between Colombia and Venezuela. The first acclaration is I am not focusing in all the border territory. I am focusing only in one territory called Catatumbo. Though I put up a map to show more or less what is this territory. The second consideration is the topic is maybe complex because I am working with communities that in many places are cultivating coca. For that, in some cases could appear that I am defending this economic. I am not defending this activity, these illegal activities. I am trying to expose the paradoxes of the communitarian practices of coexistence. The third consideration is I am presenting my paper to avoid misunderstandings with my pronunciation. To begin, I will present a short video to context the place where I work.
El problema son las manos, que cuando se te hacen llagas, que empieza a agarrar la mata, que te sangra la mano, eso es lo que tú le tienes ya miedo, no quieren. Pero entonces tú te la amarras bien y te pones fuerte, mentalizarse fuerte.
Yo pensaba que yo estaba contribuyendo con hacer el mal. Yo pensé eso, yo dije, no, Dios mío, perdóname por cada cosa que vaya a hacer, pero yo sé que me estáis mirando, pero lo estoy haciendo por una necesidad.
Con la vaina de las lluvias a veces se le hacía a uno tan difícil que se cae en la señal y a veces estabas hasta 3 semanas sin hablar con tu familia. Girabas la plata, pero no te dabas de cuenta si la familia tuya le había pasado algo. Si la madre de uno se le moría, vos te dabas de cuenta ya después de tener 15 días ya enterrado.
The border between Colombia and Venezuela, crisis and migration. It is often believed that people migrate to territories with better opportunities, or from territories in crisis to territories where they are known. For decades, Venezuela became host to many migrants attracted by its oil wealth, while Colombia was a country that expelled its population owing to violent crisis. When crisis began in Venezuela, the migratory flow was reversed. Many Venezuelans arrived in Colombia fleeing the economic and political crisis, some of them children of Colombians who migrated several years previously. The paradox is revealed when migrants arrive in places whose previous violent crises are still unresolved. One of those territories is in crisis, which is at the same time a host to migrants, is the Catatumbo, a region of Colombia very close to the border with Venezuela, and one historically affected by the armed conflict. The absence of the state and the increase of population owing to migration have left a propitious space for the generation of new conflicts and violence, as well as the growth of numerous illegal economies that fuel the armed conflict, such as the coca plantations, illegal mining, and gasoline smuggling. In the Catatumbo, the main economic activity is the cultivation of coca, reflecting high levels of poverty and unresolved armed conflict and interaction between several illicit economies. Peace negotiations with the FARC, one of the most antiquous guerrillas in Colombia, generated a strong dispute between other illegal armed groups for the control of territory, an increase of coca cultivation, and, along with it, the growth of an informal employment source that attracted a large migrant population, working as collectors of coca leaves, raspachines. Likewise, a large part of Venezuelan population that has arrived in the Catatumbo is in an irregular situation, either because they do not have passport with which to migrate legally, or because they do not have the economic resources to migrate further afield. This had led them to establish themselves in the border areas where the state presence is low, but where there are high levels of violence and illegal activities. Accelerated migration has created new conflicts on the host communities. However, in the peasant communities, forms of conflict management have also been generated that have facilitated inclusion and participation of the migrant population, and, along with this, offered protection against possible sacrificial violence. This article points on these communitarian mechanisms of justice that are source of alternative law and which, in the face of the new reality, undergo adjustments to prevent other forms or sacrificial justice being imparted, thus generating identity dynamics and promoting hospitality. In this way, practices of communitarian justice allow us to understand the relationship with the other through the construction of the rights and the acknowledgement of the other as part of us. Communitarian justice, rivalry, and conflict management. In territories with armed conflict and low state presence, there are usually two informal types of administration of justice and conflict management. On the one hand, there are territories with a strong presence of legal armed groups which manage justice through the imposition of rules and violent and arbitrary sanctions on those who violate them. This arbitrary justice coincides with the characteristics of the sacrificial violence, with the punishment or sanctions has an expiatory character, even if it does not completely contain the violence. On the other hand, there are peasant communities that have generated forms of justice to regulate conflicts and to sanction infractions from their own understanding of what is fair. Many of these practices have existed for years, but communities only reflect on them and formalize them when external actors appear to impose their own vision, to impose their own vision of justice. In some cases, community traditions have empowered community members to undertake civil resistance against the violent forms of justice imposed by illegal armed groups. If we start with mimetic theory, justice is understood as the contemporary formal institution that inherits the restorative and expiatory role of sacrifice. Justice here does not take upon itself the distribution of goods and the guarantee of rights, but rather the regulation of relationships mediated by desire, so as to control rivalry and to prevent the violence. Thus, the practice of communitarian justice can be understood as traditional ways of regulating how desire leads to competition, rivalries, and the exacerbation of violent resolutions. Manuals of communitarian coexistence produced by some peasant communities give norms that correspond to forms of prohibition and ritualization, modulating the cultural patterns that, by controlling collective behavior, prevent violent social control by an external actor. However, when there are a massive arrival of migrant population, a new paradox is generated concerning the interactions of desire. The host communities, still immersed in a crisis of violence, begin to perceive themselves as having a desirable model of our state of life. We are here than better than they are there. Given that the source of the economic model is the production of coca, what has been established is a collective culture based on an illegal activity, one that generates high circulation of money. But new conflicts are also generated based on the rivalry for access to employment, rural property, and even affective relationships. In this context, in a territory that has been historically affected by the armed conflict, the migrant population easily fulfills the role of scapegoat. In relations of rivalry, they are always at a disadvantage and therefore are more likely to be stigmatized, expelled, or victimized. It is therefore necessary to find ways to manage conflicts with those who do not know the rules of coexistence as new inhabitants of the territory. In one of these communities, at the beginning of the century, paramilitary groups that had fought leftist guerrillas, leaving many victims, were present. When paramilitaries demobilized in 2004, community carried out an exercise of civil resistance, preventing the entry of new armed groups. These resistance processes gradually consolidated until they developed an alternative coexistence process that allowed them to keep the regulatory power of the legal armed groups at bay through the creation of a manual coexistence and a committee that regulates it. Since 2016, the massive arrival of Venezuelans has had an impact on both the coexistence and the conflict on territory, which is why local armed groups have tried to control the arrival, transit, and residence of the Venezuelan population throughout the region. Arbitrary justice over the migrants was exercised through expulsion or execution, even when those in question had not committed offenses or crimes. There, it became necessary to expand and adjust their manual of coexistence to name and recognize the new people who arrived in territory. Likewise, a census and a kind of sponsorship system were generated to register the people who settled down in territory in order to know who had arrived and thus generate commitments on the part of those who welcome the migrants into their homes. This process of census and sponsorship has been replicated in several nearby communities, which has generated a greater rootedness on the part of migrants in the border territories where they have been received. These social processes are considered to be popular or alternative law, where communities agree on rules of coexistence from their own understanding about what is fair and how to sanction those who violate them. This has, on the one hand, enabled a guarantee of minimum rights to be generated that ensure the survival and economic participation of the guest other. On the other hand, it has enabled migrants, the non-citizens, to strengthen an identity that commits them to respect the coexistence agreement and to remain in territory that has hosted them. The context of Catatumbo shows us a paradox about the justice. The communities regulate what a state was unable to regulate or would regulate in another way. For example, the production of coca crops, which is the main source of income in these communities, is an illegal economic activity and therefore a crime. However, the absence of the state allows normative interactions to be different. The coca growers know that they are carrying out an illegal activity and at the same time that this economic activity is generating rivalry and violence, but often find that there is no other economic activity available to them to ensure their livelihood. So, in their understanding about what is fair for the community, the question of survival prevails over the standard used by the state, the liberal account of what is universally just. In the light of this, the community regulates the conditions of coexistence that ensure that said activity will not compromise the life or integrity of the members of community. Adapted social norms also become a way of protecting the other, who is often more vulnerable to the justice provided by the illegal armed groups. Communities that carry out their own processes of self-regulation confront the regulatory power of armed groups that seek to impose their norms and ways of imparting justice. From the perspective of the migrant population, the norms and community mechanism of conflict management ensure that they are not converted into sacrificial victims by arbitrary justice. In these territories, then, three forms of justice coexist and compete. First of all, state justice, which is often distant and inapplicable, but always remain as a reference of what should be. The second is the arbitrary justice of the armed groups that seeks to exert social control over the communities, even replicating the normative system of a state, but through violent sanctions proper of an archaic system of justice. Finally, an alternative justice of the communities that seeks to fill the vacuum, the absence of the state, and to counteract the violent norm of illegal groups. It is worth saying that community forms of justice have developed through imitating arbitrary justice. They do not arise spontaneously, but rather take as a model of form of conflict management of the guerrillas and adapt them to their practices. However, this process of imitation is creative, reflective, and non-violent, since they do not repeat violent phenomena, but seek to avoid and resist them. That is to say, they imitate it and compete with it, but they also seek to move beyond it. Border citizenship and understanding of the other. The practices of communitarian justice or alternative legal expressions that give life to the idea of what is fair for the community contribute to the exercise of citizenship beyond the ownership of or possession of a nationality. Citizenship here is understood not only as the enjoyment or access of rights within a guaranteeing state, but the active exercise of those rights, even more if it is within the framework of an empowered collective that recognizes the difference and heterogeneity of its members, which deliberates on their problems and confront them creatively. Now, the dynamics of the border territories reflect the paradox of the identities and citizenships. The usual thing is that a person has a single nationality, although each one shares cultural features with the collective of the other country. Border territories tend to have shared identity traits where the inhabitants of both sides of the border tend to have a social and cultural affinity, sometimes even stronger than they have with the rest of their compatriots. However, border citizenships go beyond shared identity traits. I call border citizenships a form of symbolic and normative interactions between subjects in border territories, an interaction that exceeds the laws of each country. It refers to the way in which citizens of two countries understand each other as part of the shared territory, and therefore their identities are source of agreements that regulate coexistence and interactions in territory. Historically, the border between Colombia and Venezuela has been porous and flexible. Cultural and commercial relations have been informal, and even the laws of each country have adapted to these social interactions. The peasant communities of the Catatumbo, which self-regulate their existence, have managed to overcome the crisis of constant conflict through adapting their coexistence agreements to include the migrant population. The social contract is adapted to include the other as part of us. For this reason, communitarian regulations go beyond to the understanding of the shared identity and generate forms of an alternative jurisprudence that are appropriate to border citizenship. This is the ability to generate agreements that include the other in the shared vision of the collective. Although border citizenship does not grant formal membership to the collective, it is the result of a process of communitarian reflection that has allowed its participants to overcome notions of violent and arbitrary justice. Furthermore, this process seeks the guarantee of civil, economic, and social rights through the generation of agreements that ensure coexistence and respect for the life of the incoming other. This other, who is welcomed, who understands the collective agreements of coexistence and abides by them, participates in community dynamics and exercise what I have called border citizenship. Hospitality, regulating what cannot be regulated. The issue of communitarian justice in the context of migration leads me to a question I asked myself many years ago. How does one regulate a right of hospitality if hospitality can be regulated? In some times of massive global migration, Kant's proposal for a right of universal hospitality has once again become valid. However, from a Girardian perspective, I believe that hospitality goes far beyond what Kant proposed, namely, the right of the migrant not to be treated with hostility in a territory that is not his. To paraphrase the poet Edmond Javès, hospitality is beyond responsibility, is to welcome the other only because of his presence, in the name of his own existence, only for what he represents, for what he is. Hospitality is at the level of grace, where I recognize myself in and with the other whom I welcomed. Kant, by reducing hospitality to the requirement of non-hostility and putting it at the level of what can be regulated, diminishes what it is about and reduces its effectiveness. Hospitality is to do with people who understand themselves as a construction shared with the other who receives. It is to do with those who do not compete with the other, who do not sacrifice what is different, but who welcome it as someone worthy of contributing to the constructions of their own identity. Hence, hospitality converges with the Girardian concept of interindividuality, that is to say, the relational character of identity. Therefore, hospitality, if it can be understood as a right, is not claimed by those who ask to be received. It is exercised by the one who welcomes. That is, it can be understood as an alternative right within a civil society that demands that its right to receive and to be hospitable should be respected. However, in an extremely violent social context where there are different actors who impede hospitality towards the migrant, a minimum number of social norms are necessary to protect the guest. The scenarios of regulation and conflict management undertaken by the peasant communities are an example of how to generate a minimum regulatory space which addresses hospitality and defends the group's right to receive and protect the migrant. Likewise, this peasant community's experience of coexistence still full of paradoxes, also help us to reveal and understand the persistent paradoxes in institutionalized system of justice, where sacrificial dynamics persist and, nevertheless, civil society claims them to be foundational for collective order. As we come to understand the paradoxical character of communitarian justice, precisely in this space, a horizon is opened up by which the dynamics of institutional justice may be humanized. Thanks.
So once again, yes, Miguel. That is Miguel, isn't it?
Gracias. Very well done. Thank you for this. A question about the hospitality and the interaction seems reasonable and special, but the overwhelming numbers, when the numbers are huge, does the same dynamic take place? Can they be overwhelmed and so then resentment and it breaks down? That's my question.
Can you repeat? Or say
Pues si los números son enormes de los migrantes cruzando de Venezuela a Colombia, no es como antes de los colombianos a Venezuela, entonces ahora con la guerra y todo, it's just an overwhelming influx. What happens to this principle of hospitality? Does it stay the same or is it destabilized?
This is a complex question because how I say at the beginning, I am focusing on in peasant communities where there is a massive migration, but not as massive as how you can see in the big cities. The main city in the border is Cucuta. Cucuta is more or less 1 million people, but you can see all the time people crossing the border, and it's difficult to identify if these people is migrant to stay in this city or crossing to go beyond, to go to other country or another part of Colombia, or they are only crossing to get food or medicines and to return to Venezuela. Usually in these communities, in these peasant communities, the people migrate to stay for a while, for a few months, and they are moving a lot, but move on the territory, in the region. For that, to be a little precisely, in these territories, we can understand the hospitality because the peasant communities have another strategies of coexistence different of the cities, of the communities of the cities. If you see the question about hospitality in a very large city, you can see the context of a neighborhoods, because if you see the question massively, you will see the opposite. You will see xenophobia, you will see the hate, because for decades, Colombians migrate to Venezuela, but it was a very slow migration. Now, Venezuelans have migrated more than 2 million people in less than 3 years. For that, it was a very explosive migration that have questioned to the Colombian people.
Thank you. Up here. Here. No, yeah. Please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for an incredibly rich presentation. I would have so many questions. I will limit myself to one small one. When you speak of those codes of coexistence, first question, are these texts? And in this case, is anybody collecting and studying them? Because this would be a huge topic for the philosophy and theory of law. I mean, how a spontaneous organization of some sort of legal system arises among people who, if I understand correctly, do not have any formal knowledge of law. Is anything being done with this stuff? Because I think it would be great. Thank you so much for mentioning it.
Yeah, and I can answer this question in two perspectives. From anthropology, or how the community was in the process to regulate their own coexistence, but also about the legal pluralism. In Colombia, there are more developed the legal pluralism with indigenous people, with indigenous communities, but with peasant communities, they are not regulated. But their spontaneous experience could be more successful because they try to regulate their own coexistence about their different different ways about the migration. Include many of the peasant communities are internal migrants because they do not born in these places. They migrate from other regions of Colombia. But the indigenous people regulate about the historical traditions by their own. And then I think we have still a very important space to understand how the communities regulate and to put in dialogue the legal pluralism and the experience of anthropological relationships to regulate For that, I say that many of these experience of self-regulation, there was not completely spontaneous. Many of this was an inherits of the regulation of the armed groups. When the guerrillas abandoned the territory, tell the communities, now it's your responsibility. Then the manual of coexistence exists. Now it's yours. Now it's your obligation to regulate your own convivence, your coexistence.
Thank you. I know there are a number of questions, and this conversation will be continued in other places, but we've run out of our time, so I'd like to give the monetary award of $1,500 to Ivan. So I'd just like to conclude by saying to our 3 award winners, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you.